A homeless mom spent her last $50 on an abandoned clock shop, knowing that if she was wrong, she and her newborn daughter could have nowhere safe to sleep that night. Everyone would have called it a desperate mistake, until she heard a mysterious ticking behind a sealed wall. What Charlotte discovered inside had been hidden for nearly 100 years. And it came with a terrifying deadline. She had less than 24 hours before it could become worthless forever. Keep watching, because what happened next left millions in tears. August 20th, 2026 was the day Charlotte Cole stopped wondering how much worse life could get. She already knew. At 34, Charlotte was homeless, exhausted, and carrying everything she still owned in 2 battered bags. But the most precious thing she carried wasn't in either of them. It was sleeping against her chest. Her 6-day-old daughter, Emma. Charlotte sat on a weathered bench outside a bus station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, gently rocking her newborn beneath a thin gray blanket. Cars rushed past. Strangers hurried home to warm dinners, locked doors, and beds waiting for them. Charlotte had none of those things. She had $50. That was it. $50 between her newborn baby and another night with nowhere to call home. Only months earlier, Charlotte had been working, paying rent, and preparing for motherhood. Then medical expenses piled up. She missed work. Bills went unpaid. And that morning, the final door had closed behind her. Charlotte looked down at Emma's tiny face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, fighting back tears. "I promise I'll figure something out." She didn't know how. Then, while searching through local listings on her cracked phone, Charlotte noticed something strange. Property liquidation abandoned clock shop. The photographs showed a narrow brick building that looked almost forgotten by time. Its windows were boarded. Paint peeled from the entrance. The roof appeared damaged, and the description warned that the property had been vacant for decades. Nobody wanted it. Then Charlotte saw the starting bid. $50. Exactly what she had left. Every reasonable thought told her to keep the money. Buy diapers. Buy formula. Buy food. Maybe pay for one safe night somewhere. But $50 wouldn't give Emma a home. This abandoned building might... Charlotte stared at the screen for a long time. Then she looked at her sleeping daughter. And pressed bid. No one bid against her. Minutes later, Charlotte owned an abandoned clock shop she had never seen in person, and she had $0 left. By late afternoon, Charlotte stood before the building with Emma strapped securely against her chest. The place looked even worse than the photographs. She forced the swollen wooden door open. Dust rolled through the fading sunlight. Dozens of antique clocks covered the walls. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, brass carriage clocks, but every pendulum was still. Every hand was frozen. The entire building seemed dead. Charlotte stepped farther inside. Then she heard it. Tick. She froze. Tick. Her eyes moved across the silent clocks. None of them were running. Tick. The sound was coming from the dark back office. Charlotte tightened one arm around Emma and slowly walked toward it. She didn't know it yet, but spending her last $50 hadn't simply bought her a ruined building. Something had been hidden inside that clock shop for nearly 100 years. And what Charlotte was about to discover would turn one homeless mother's desperate gamble into a story that would eventually leave millions of people in tears. Tick, tick, tick. And somewhere behind that wall, time was running out. Charlotte stood perfectly still. Tick. The sound came again. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Tick. Emma stirred against her chest, releasing a tiny sigh before settling back to sleep. Charlotte instinctively placed one hand over her daughter's back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. But Charlotte wasn't sure she believed her own words. The abandoned clock shop had been sealed for years. Every clock she had passed was broken. Some were missing their hands. Others had cracked faces or rusted pendulums frozen beneath decades of dust. Yet something inside this building was still keeping time. Charlotte switched on the flashlight of her cracked phone and entered the back office. The room was barely larger than a closet. An overturned desk rested beneath a shattered window. Yellowed invoices covered the floor. Cobwebs stretched between empty shelves, and water stains crawled down the plaster like dark veins. Tick. Charlotte turned towards the left wall. Louder! She moved closer. Tick. She pressed her ear against the wood. The vibration was unmistakable. Something was moving behind the wall. Charlotte stepped back and examined the paneling. Most of the wood was thin, warped and rotting, except for one section. It was thicker, reinforced, and strangely untouched by decay. Her pulse quickened. Why would anyone reinforce a wall inside an abandoned clock shop? Charlotte searched through the room until she found an old toolbox beneath the desk. Inside was a rust-covered hammer. She hesitated. This building was everything she owned now. Destroying part of it on her first day seemed insane. But then, tick. Charlotte gripped the hammer. The first strike barely damaged the panel. The second sent a crack through the wood. The third broke through. A hollow echo rolled through the wall. Charlotte stopped. There was empty space behind it. She carefully set Emma into an old wooden drawer she had lined with her blanket, keeping the baby within arm's reach. Then she swung again. And again. Chunks of wood fell across the floor until Charlotte tore away enough of the false wall to see what had been hidden behind it. Her breath caught. It wasn't another room. It was a machine. A massive brass mechanism filled the cavity from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of gears interlocked with one another. Copper rods disappeared into the brickwork. A large pendulum moved slowly at the center. Left, right, left, right. And with every movement, tick, Charlotte stared in disbelief. After nearly a century, the mechanism was somehow still running. Then she noticed something even stranger. A thick brass shaft extended downward from the gears and disappeared beneath the floor. Charlotte followed it. 3 loose floorboards concealed a narrow staircase. Her hands began trembling. Every instinct told her to take Emma and leave. But leave for where? She had no apartment waiting for her. No hotel room. No money. This ruined shop was all they had. Charlotte lifted the boards. A cold draft rose from below. Using her phone for light, she descended several narrow steps into a hidden chamber. And there, beneath the clock shop, stood a massive iron safe. It was unlike anything Charlotte had ever seen. No electronic keypad, no ordinary combination dial. Instead, brass cables connected the safe directly to the mechanism upstairs. On its door was a small engraved plate. Charlotte wiped away the dust. 3 words appeared. When need is greatest. Charlotte swallowed hard. The clock mechanism suddenly clicked. A gear turned. Then another. The safe released a deep metallic sound. Clunk! The door moved. Charlotte almost screamed. She pulled it open. No piles of cash waited inside. No diamonds. No gold bars. Only a small leather-bound ledger, several rolled documents, and an envelope darkened by age. Charlotte picked up the ledger. The leather cracked beneath her fingers. She opened it. Most entries were dated between 1924 and 1926. Payments, property records, bond numbers. Then she reached the final handwritten page. One sentence had been underlined twice. Charlotte read it aloud. What remains has been preserved for a time of extreme need. Her eyes immediately moved toward Emma upstairs. Extreme need. Charlotte almost laughed at the cruelty of those words. She had $50 that morning. Now she had nothing. She was sleeping in an abandoned building with a newborn child. If this wasn't extreme need, what was? Then something slipped from between the ledger's pages. A small blueprint. Charlotte unfolded it across the safe. It showed the exact floor plan of the clock shop. A red mark had been drawn beneath the main showroom. Beside it was a handwritten instruction. 12 boards from the east wall. Charlotte's heartbeat accelerated. She rushed upstairs. 1, 2, 3. She counted the floorboards. By the time she reached 12, her hands were shaking. Charlotte wedged the hammer beneath the board and pulled. It lifted. Underneath was another layer of wood. And beneath that, a narrow metal compartment. Charlotte reached inside. Her fingers touched paper. Not one sheet. Dozens. She pulled out the first bundle. The documents were thick, beautifully printed, and sealed with faded gold embossing. Charlotte didn't understand exactly what she was holding, but she understood one thing. These were not ordinary papers. Then she saw the date printed across the top. August 21, 1926. Charlotte stared at it. August 21. Her eyes slowly moved to the date on her phone. August 20, 2026. Exactly 100 years. Her heart began pounding. She opened the ledger again, searching desperately through the handwritten notes until she found a passage about the documents hidden beneath the floor. And then she read the final line. Charlotte went cold. Whatever she had just discovered had a deadline. A deadline measured not in months, not in weeks, but in hours. At midnight, the final day would begin. And for the first time since entering the shop, Charlotte understood something terrifying. The mysterious clock behind the wall wasn't simply keeping time. It was counting down. And if Charlotte couldn't understand what she had found before that countdown ended, the fortune hidden beneath her feet for a century might become worthless forever. Charlotte stared at the date until the numbers blurred. August 21, 1926. Her eyes dropped to her phone again. August 20th, 2026. For a few seconds, she couldn't move. Emma began crying from the back office. The sound snapped Charlotte out of her trance. She hurried to her daughter, lifted the newborn into her arms, and held her close. I'm here, Charlotte whispered. Mommy's here. But as she rocked Emma beneath the dead clocks, Charlotte couldn't stop looking at the bundle of documents lying on the floor. An hour earlier, she had believed she owned nothing but a collapsing building. Now something worth hiding for a century was sitting beneath her feet. The question was, what exactly had she found? Charlotte carried Emma back to the hidden compartment and carefully removed the remaining documents. There were 48 certificates. Each was printed on heavy paper, decorated with intricate borders and stamped with a faded metallic seal. Across the top were the words, Gold-pressed redemption bond. Charlotte had never seen anything like them. She opened the leather ledger again. This time, she read every line carefully. The original clockmaker, Walter Harrow, had apparently accepted the bonds in the 1920s as payment connected to several commercial properties and private loans. According to his notes, they were backed by assets whose value was tied to gold. But Walter had never redeemed them. Instead, he had hidden them. Why? Charlotte turned another page. A handwritten paragraph answered her question. Walter believed the bonds should remain untouched until his family faced a crisis so severe that everything else had failed. They are not wealth for comfort, he had written. They are protection against ruin. Charlotte stopped reading. Protection against ruin. She looked around the abandoned shop, then at her sleeping newborn, then at the empty diaper bag beside her. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Walter, she whispered, I think this qualifies. But the next page erased her smile. A clause had been copied carefully from the original bond agreement. Charlotte read it once. Then again, her stomach tightened. The certificates could be presented for final redemption only within their contractual lifespan. 100 years from the date of issue? Charlotte grabbed the first certificate. Issued August 21st, 1926. She checked another. Same date. Another. Same. Every certificate carried the same deadline. August 21, 2026. Tomorrow? No. Charlotte frantically searched the ledger, hoping she had misunderstood. She hadn't. After the centennial redemption date passed, the special claim attached to the certificates would expire. A fortune had survived wars, recessions, changing owners, collapsing businesses, and nearly a century beneath a dusty floor. And Charlotte had discovered it with barely 1 day left. Her hands shook so badly that she nearly dropped the ledger. But there was another question. Were these papers actually worth anything? Charlotte photographed one certificate and began searching through historical financial archives on her phone. The numbers she found made little sense at first. Old principal values, gold-linked calculations, historical adjustments. She found a modern inflation calculator and began making rough comparisons. 1 certificate, then 10, then all 48. Charlotte stopped. That can't be right. She calculated again. Her breathing grew shallow. Even using a conservative estimate, the original value adjusted across a century represented a staggering amount of money. Not thousands, not tens of thousands, potentially millions of dollars. Charlotte looked at Emma. That morning, she had been wondering how to afford diapers. Now she was sitting on the floor of an abandoned clock shop, holding documents that, if authentic and legally redeemable, could secure her daughter's future. A home. Education. Safety. Everything Charlotte had been terrified she could never provide. Tears filled her eyes. For one dangerous moment, she allowed herself to imagine it. Emma growing up with her own bedroom. A refrigerator that was always full. No eviction notices. No nights wondering where they would sleep. Then Charlotte noticed something at the bottom of the ledger. An address. Central Clearinghouse Financial Instruments Division. Below it, Walter had written one final warning. Original certificates must be physically presented and authenticated before expiration. Copies shall not be honored. Charlotte's hope collapsed into panic. Physical presentation. Authentication. Before expiration. She checked the time. The clearinghouse was in the city center. But first, she had to prove the bonds were genuine. And she had less than 24 hours. Charlotte looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully against her. "No," she whispered. "Not this time." She had spent months watching doors close. Her job, her apartment, her savings, her security. Everything had disappeared piece by piece. But this door was still open. Barely. Charlotte gathered the certificates and wrapped them carefully inside her jacket. Then she looked toward the hidden brass mechanism. Tick. The sound suddenly felt louder. Tick. Less mysterious. Tick. More terrifying. Because Charlotte finally understood what every second represented. A bottle of formula. A safe bed. A home. Her daughter's future. And with every tick, another second of that future was disappearing. Charlotte picked up her phone and began searching for anyone who could authenticate century-old financial documents tonight. She didn't know whom to trust. She didn't know whether the clearinghouse would honor the certificates. She didn't even know whether she could reach it in time. But she knew one thing. When morning came, Charlotte would either be holding the answer to every prayer she had whispered while homeless, or 48 beautiful pieces of worthless paper. And somewhere inside the wall, tick, tick, tick. The 100-year countdown continued. Charlotte's phone showed 11:17 p.m. Less than 43 minutes until August 21st began. She sat on the dusty floor with Emma sleeping against her chest. surrounded by 48 certificates that might be worth millions or absolutely nothing. Charlotte had spent the last hour calling every number she could find. Banks, auction houses, historical societies, financial attorneys. Most calls went unanswered. One person laughed before hanging up. Another warned her that old certificates sold online for $20 as decorations. With every rejection, Charlotte felt the hope inside her shrinking. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. Charlotte Cole. Yes. My name is Elliot Hayes. I authenticate historical financial instruments for private digital archives. You sent photographs of several bonds. Charlotte sat upright. Yes, please tell me they're real. There was silence. Then Elliot said something she wasn't prepared to hear. Where did you get these? Charlotte's heart pounded. An abandoned clock shop? Another pause. Do not post another photograph online. Charlotte froze. Why? Because if these serial numbers match the archived registry I'm looking at, you may have found original certificates from a private 1926 issue. Her hand flew to her mouth. So they're valuable. I didn't say that. Hope crashed back into fear. Elliot explained that old financial documents could appear authentic while having no redeemable value. Paper, ink, signatures, embossing, serial numbers, everything had to match. He asked Charlotte to photograph specific details. She placed Emma beside her and began. The watermark, the gold seal, the signatures, the serial numbers, the edges of the paper. Minutes crawled past. 11:36 p.m. Charlotte could hear only Emma's breathing and the mechanism behind the wall. Tick. 11:43 p.m. Mr. Hayes. I'm still checking. Charlotte closed her eyes. For months, she had believed survival meant simply enduring one more day. Find enough food. Find somewhere warm. Keep Emma safe. Don't think about next month because tomorrow was already frightening enough. But sitting there, Charlotte suddenly understood something. If these bonds were real, money alone wasn't the miracle. The miracle was that she had finally been given a chance to fight forward instead of merely survive backward. She looked at Emma. I don't want you growing up afraid of tomorrow, she whispered. Her phone crackled. Charlotte. She grabbed it. Yes. Elliot's voice had changed. I found the registry. Charlotte stopped breathing. The serial sequence matches. Her eyes filled with tears. The issuer's seal matches. The signatures are consistent with authenticated examples. Even the paper pattern appears correct. Charlotte pressed her hand against her mouth. So they're real! They appear to be... She began crying. But Elliot immediately continued. Listen carefully. Authentication isn't redemption. Charlotte's smile disappeared. What does that mean? It means you've passed the first problem. Now you have a much bigger one. He had found the original redemption provisions. The certificates had to be physically presented at the designated clearing institution before the contractual window closed. No photographs. No digital submission. No mailing them tomorrow. Charlotte looked at the address in Walter's ledger. How long do I have? Until the end of August 21. Charlotte stared at Emma. One day. A single day stood between homelessness and a future she could barely imagine. Then Elliot asked the question that changed everything. How many certificates do you have? 48. Silence. Mr. Hayes. I'm calculating. Charlotte waited. Finally, Elliot exhaled. If the clearing institution recognizes the original terms and the underlying asset adjustments. He stopped. How much? Charlotte whispered. I can't promise a final figure. How much? His answer made her knees weak. Potentially enough that Charlotte would never again have to wonder where Emma would sleep. Enough for a home. Enough for education. Enough to rebuild an entire life. Charlotte looked around the ruined shop. That morning, she had seen herself as a woman with nothing. A homeless mother who had gambled away her final $50? Now she saw something different. She was still frightened, still exhausted, still holding a newborn in a building with broken windows, but she was no longer waiting for someone to rescue her. Charlotte stood. She carefully wrapped the certificates in waterproof cloth and placed them inside the strongest bag she could find. Then she secured Emma against her chest. For the first time that day, her hands weren't shaking. "Where are you going?" Elliot asked. "To make sure I'm standing at that clearinghouse when the doors open." Charlotte headed toward the front of the shop. Then, clank. She stopped. The brass mechanism behind the wall jerked violently. A second metallic crash echoed beneath the floor. Charlotte turned. Something had changed. The ticking had stopped. Then she heard a much worse sound. Thud. The hidden security system had engaged. Charlotte rushed toward the compartment. The floor panel wouldn't move. She pulled harder. Nothing. The certificates she had prepared were only part of the discovery. The ledger and several original verification documents were still inside the safe below. Documents Elliot had just told her she might need. Charlotte grabbed the hammer. Outside, the first hint of dawn was still hours away. Inside, a century-old security bolt had just jammed shut. She stared at the sealed floor. For months, Charlotte had asked herself, "Why does everything keep happening to me?" But this time, she asked a different question. "What am I going to do about it?" She tightened her grip on the hammer. Emma slept against her heart. And somewhere behind the wall, after nearly 100 years of ticking, there was only silence. Charlotte suddenly missed the sound, because now the clock wasn't warning her anymore. It was waiting to see whether she would give up. Charlotte tightened both hands around the hammer. For several seconds, she simply stared at the sealed floor. The 48 bonds were already packed safely in her bag, but the original ledger, blueprints, and verification documents remained trapped inside the iron safe below. Without them, Elliot had warned her, the clearinghouse might refuse to authenticate the history of the certificates. Millions of dollars could depend on pieces of paper sitting only a few feet beneath her. And she couldn't reach them. Charlotte struck the wooden panel beside the mechanism. Nothing. Again. Bang. Emma startled against her chest and began to cry. Charlotte immediately stopped. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sorry." She kissed her daughter's forehead. For a moment, the exhaustion hit her all at once. She hadn't slept properly in days. She hadn't eaten since that afternoon. Her bank account was empty. Her phone battery showed 12%. And now she was standing inside a ruined clock shop in the middle of the night, trying to defeat a 100-year-old machine with a rusty hammer. The absurdity almost made her laugh. Instead, tears came. "I'm trying, Emma," she whispered. "Mommy is trying so hard." Her phone rang. "Elliot! Charlotte, are you still there?" The safe locked itself. "What?" She explained the mechanism. Elliot went silent. Then he asked, "Do you still have the blueprint you photographed?" Charlotte looked at her phone. "Yes." "Open it." She enlarged the image. Near the bottom of the drawing was a symbol she had ignored before a tiny circle beside the words. "Manual release East gear assembly." Charlotte's heart jumped. There was another way in. She hurried back to the broken wall and examined the brass mechanism. Dust covered everything. Then she saw it. Behind the largest gear was a narrow iron lever. Charlotte reached inside. Too far? She couldn't touch it. She found an old metal rod on the floor and pushed it through the gears. Almost, her fingers trembled. "Come on!" The rod slipped. She tried again. This time, it caught the lever. Charlotte pulled. Nothing happened. "Harder," Elliot said through the phone. Charlotte planted one foot against the wall and pulled with everything she had. The lever suddenly moved. Clack. Below her, Something released. Charlotte nearly collapsed with relief. She lifted the floorboards. The passage was open. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Elliot replied. "Get those documents and get moving." Charlotte descended into the hidden chamber and retrieved everything from the safe. But as she lifted the leather ledger, something beneath it caught her attention. A sealed envelope. She hadn't noticed it before. On the front, written in faded ink, were 4 words. "To the next keeper." Charlotte hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page from Walter Harrow. The letter explained why he had built the hidden mechanism. Walter had watched families lose homes and businesses during difficult years. He had seen wealth disappear while neighbors suffered. And so he left one final request. If the hidden assets ever saved someone from ruin, that person should remember what desperation felt like. Not as shame, as responsibility. Charlotte read the final sentence twice. "If fortune finds you in your darkest hour, become the light someone else is searching for." She looked around the chamber. Something inside her shifted. Until that moment, Charlotte had imagined what the money could buy. A house, a car, a college fund for Emma, security. But now another possibility entered her mind. What if this building didn't have to remain a symbol of the worst day of her life? What if it could become something else? A place where struggling mothers could find help. A warm room? Food? Childcare resources. Someone willing to listen before another family reached the breaking point. Charlotte folded Walter's letter and placed it beside the ledger. For the first time, she understood that the discovery might offer more than an escape. It might offer a purpose. But first, she had to survive the next 24 hours. By 5:42, Charlotte had everything packed. The bonds, the ledger, the blueprints, Walter's letter. She wrapped them in plastic to protect them from the rain that had begun tapping against the boarded windows. Then another problem became painfully obvious. The clearinghouse was across the city. Charlotte had no car. No money for a taxi? And public transportation wouldn't begin running normally for another hour. She looked at Emma, then at the bag containing what might be their entire future. There was only one option. Walk. Charlotte stepped outside into the cold morning rain. One hand protected Emma beneath her coat. The other clutched the documents against her body. Every block hurt. Her shoes were soaked within minutes. Her legs burned. But she kept moving. Because Charlotte was no longer walking like a homeless woman with nowhere to go. She was walking toward something. Toward a chance. Toward a future. Toward the possibility that Emma might someday hear this story and understand that her life changed because her mother refused to stop moving when stopping would have been easier. Then Charlotte's phone vibrated. A message from Elliot. She opened it. Her heart sank. "Urgent, I contacted the clearing institution. There may be a problem with the redemption authorization. Call me immediately." Charlotte stopped in the rain. Cars rushed past. Emma slept beneath her coat. The clearinghouse was now only a few miles away. Charlotte stared at the message. After everything she had survived, one final obstacle was waiting. And this one couldn't be broken open with a hammer. She pressed call. Elliot answered immediately. "Charlotte," he said, his voice tense. "Before you reach that building, there's something you need to know." Charlotte tightened her grip on the bonds. "What?" Elliot paused, then said the words she had feared all night. "They may not be required to pay you." Charlotte stopped beneath the awning of a closed bakery, rain dripping from her hair. "What do you mean they may not have to pay?" Elliot exhaled slowly. "The bonds appear authentic. That's not the problem." "Then what is—" "The original holder was Walter Harrow. The clearinghouse may require proof that you legally inherited his claim." Charlotte felt the strength leave her legs. "I didn't inherit anything. I bought the building." "I know." She looked down at Emma. For one terrible second, Charlotte saw the entire future she had imagined disappearing. The warm bedroom, the full refrigerator, Emma growing up without fearing eviction. All of it. Gone. The old Charlotte might have collapsed. The woman who had spent months apologizing for circumstances she couldn't control might have accepted another closed door as proof that she simply wasn't meant to get through. But something had changed inside that clock shop. Charlotte wiped the tears from her face. Tell me what I need to prove. Elliot paused. Charlotte. No, don't tell me why this won't work. Tell me what I need. Elliot became quiet. Then his voice sharpened. Ownership. Charlotte frowned. The auction deed. Exactly. If the bonds were legally transferred with the contents of the property, and the auction terms included abandoned fixtures, records, and assets, you may have a legitimate claim. Charlotte's heart began pounding again. The auction confirmation was on her phone. She opened the email. Her battery flashed. 7%. Charlotte scrolled desperately through the contract. Property, fixtures, furnishings, abandoned contents. Then she found it. Sale includes all contents remaining on premises at transfer of ownership, except where otherwise prohibited by law. Elliot, you found something. She read the clause. Silence. Then Elliot said, Save that document immediately. Charlotte took screenshots. 6%. Now get to the clearinghouse. Charlotte stepped back into the rain. 2 miles. Then 1. Every step became a battle. Emma needed feeding. Charlotte's shoulders ached. Her soaked shoes rubbed painfully against her heels. Twice she had to stop. But every time her body told her she couldn't continue. She remembered Walter's letter. Become the light someone else is searching for. By the time Charlotte reached the financial district, morning sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. Then she saw it. A stone building towering above the street. The clearinghouse. Charlotte checked the time. 7:46 at Mum. The doors opened at 8. She had made it. Charlotte sat on the steps with Emma in her arms. Business people passed in pressed suits, some glancing at the exhausted woman with wet clothes and a battered bag. Yesterday, those looks would have humiliated her. Today, they didn't, because none of them knew what she had survived to reach those steps. None knew that the woman they might mistake for someone defeated had spent the night breaking through walls, uncovering a century-old secret, and walking across a rain-soaked city with her newborn against her heart. At exactly 8 hours, the doors opened. Charlotte stood. Inside, a security guard looked at her clothes. Can I help you? Yes. I have an appointment. No. Then you'll need to. Charlotte placed one certificate on the counter. The guard stopped. Minutes later, she was sitting inside a private office across from Madeline Pierce, a senior administrator. Madeline examined the certificate without expression. Where did you obtain this? Charlotte told her everything. The auction. The clock shop. The wall. The safe. Walter's ledger. When Charlotte finished, Madeline folded her hands. These certificates are extremely unusual. Are they real? That isn't the only question. Madeline explained that authentication could take hours. Legal ownership had to be reviewed. The original redemption terms had to be verified. And if you don't finish today, Madeline looked directly at her. The claim could expire. Charlotte felt fear rising again. But she didn't beg. She didn't cry. Instead, she opened her bag. She placed Walter's ledger on the table. Then the blueprints. The auction deed. The ownership clause. Finally, all 48 bonds. I've spent months being told no, Charlotte said quietly. Madeline watched her. I was told no when I asked for more time on my rent, no when I needed help, no when I tried to keep my life from falling apart. Charlotte looked down at Emma. Yesterday, I had $50 and nowhere for my daughter to sleep. Her voice trembled, but she continued. Today, I'm not asking you for charity. She pushed the documents forward. I'm asking you to examine the evidence. Madeline stared at her for several seconds. Then she reached for the phone. Get legal down here. Charlotte's heart jumped. And archives. Another call? Tell them this is priority. For the first time, Charlotte realized what had truly changed. It wasn't her bank account. Not yet. It wasn't the bonds. They could still become worthless. Charlotte had changed. The frightened mother who had entered that abandoned shop believing she had nothing left was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that losing almost everything had left her with one thing no institution could take away: the courage to keep fighting. Hours passed. Documents moved between departments. Experts arrived. Signatures were compared. Serial numbers were verified. Emma slept in Charlotte's arms. Then, shortly before noon, Madeline returned. She closed the office door. Her expression was unreadable. Charlotte stood. Please, she whispered. Just tell me. Madeline placed a folder on the desk. The authentication is complete. Charlotte's heart hammered. And Madeline looked directly into her eyes. The bonds are genuine. Charlotte covered her mouth. But Madeline wasn't smiling. There is still one final authorization. Charlotte lowered her hand. What authorization? Madeline glanced at the clock. If it fails, none of this matters. Charlotte followed her gaze. The seconds continued moving. She had come too far to turn back now. So she held Emma closer and said the words she couldn't have said yesterday. Then tell me where I need to go. Madeline Pierce didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the folder containing Charlotte's documents and walked toward the door. Come with me. Charlotte followed her through a long marble hallway. Emma sleeping against her chest. They entered the conference room where 3 people were already waiting. An attorney, an archival specialist, and a senior clearing officer. On the table lay Walter Harrow's ledger, Charlotte's auction deed, and all 48 bonds. The clearing officer adjusted his glasses. Ms. Cole, we've confirmed the certificates are authentic. Charlotte nodded. We've also confirmed that the auction transferred the abandoned contents of the property to you. Charlotte's heart began beating faster. But there was one final issue. Of course there was. Charlotte tightened her arms around Emma. The officer opened Walter's ledger. These instruments were created under unusual private redemption terms. We needed to establish whether the rights attached to them survived the transfer of the property. Charlotte could barely breathe. And the officer looked toward the attorney. The attorney nodded. The transfer is valid. Charlotte froze. She had imagined this moment all night. She thought she would scream, cry, collapse. Instead, she simply stared at them. Valid. Madeline finally smiled. They're yours, Charlotte. Her knees weakened. She lowered herself into a chair. Emma stirred. Charlotte looked down at her daughter's tiny face. Did you hear that she whispered? Her voice broke. We're going to be okay. That was when the tears came. Not because Charlotte suddenly felt rich. Because for the first time since Emma was born, she could say those words and believe them. We're going to be okay. The final valuation and redemption process took several more hours. Historical principle, contractual adjustments, and the surviving asset provisions all had to be reconciled. Charlotte understood almost none of the calculations. Then Madeline slid a document across the table. The confirmed payout was life-changing. Enough to buy a home outright. Enough to secure Emma's education. Enough that Charlotte would never again have to choose between groceries and rent. Enough to make the woman who had possessed only $50 the day before stare at the page in stunned silence. But Charlotte didn't ask about cars. She didn't ask about mansions. Her first question was, when will I have enough available to get my daughter somewhere safe tonight? Madeline's expression softened. We can arrange that today. Charlotte closed her eyes. That answer meant more than every number on the page. That evening, Charlotte sat beside Emma in a quiet hotel room. There was a crib, clean sheets, warm water, a refrigerator containing formula and food, ordinary things. Things millions of people passed every day without noticing. To Charlotte, they felt like miracles. She stood beside the crib long after Emma fell asleep. 24 hours earlier, Charlotte had been homeless. She had spent her last $50 on a building everyone else had abandoned. Now her daughter's future was secure. But Walter's letter wouldn't leave her mind. If fortune finds you in your darkest hour, become the light someone else is searching for. 3 weeks later, a developer contacted Charlotte. He wanted the clock shop. The neighborhood was changing, and the property occupied valuable land. His offer was generous. Charlotte refused. Then another developer offered more. She refused again. People told her she was making a terrible financial decision. Charlotte had heard that before. She returned to the shop one morning with Emma in her arms. Sunlight entered through the boarded windows. Dust still covered the counters. Broken clocks still hung silently along the walls. Charlotte walked into the back office. The brass mechanism remained exposed behind the wall. She placed her hand against the old wood. This building had found her when she had nowhere else to go. She wasn't going to destroy it. She was going to give it a second life. Over the following months, workers restored the brickwork, repaired the roof, and preserved the antique clocks. But Charlotte didn't reopen it merely as a clock shop. She created something she wished had existed when she was desperate. A community center for struggling families. There was a pantry, a room where mothers could receive diapers, formula, and baby supplies. Counselors helped families facing eviction. Local volunteers offered job search assistance and childcare support. And above the entrance, Charlotte placed a simple sign. The Harrow House, time for a second chance. She kept one section of the original clock shop untouched. The broken wall, the brass mechanism, and Walter's letter protected behind glass. Years later, visitors would stand before it and hear Charlotte tell the story. But she never began with the millions. She began with $50, because that was the part that mattered. I thought losing everything meant my life was over. Charlotte would say, but sometimes the moment you think you've reached the end is the moment you're being asked to choose what kind of person you'll become next. Then she would look toward Emma, now running safely through the building her mother once entered with nothing. Charlotte had found money beneath those floorboards. But the real fortune wasn't buried there. It was what she chose to build afterward. A home for her daughter. A refuge for strangers. A legacy born from the worst day of her life. And every evening, before Charlotte locked the doors, the restored clock above the entrance rang across the neighborhood. Not as a countdown anymore. Not as a warning. But as a reminder. Time had almost taken everything from Charlotte Cole. Instead, she used the time she was given to make sure someone else would never have to face their darkest hour alone. Charlotte's story was never really about finding millions of dollars. It was about what happens when life leaves you with almost nothing, and you still choose to take one more step forward. She began with only $50, a newborn daughter in her arms, and no place to call home. Everything told her she had already lost. Yet one desperate decision led her to a forgotten clock shop. And behind its silent walls waited an opportunity that had survived for nearly a century. But Charlotte's greatest victory wasn't the fortune. It was what she did with it. She could have walked away, forgotten the fear of homelessness, and lived comfortably for the rest of her life. Instead, she remembered every cold night, every closed door, and every moment she had felt invisible. Then she turned her second chance into someone else's first hope. Maybe that is the lesson we should carry with us. Your darkest chapter does not have to become your final chapter. Sometimes one more decision, one more act of courage, or one more day of refusing to quit can change everything. And if life ever gives you the opportunity to rise, reach back and help someone else rise with you. If Charlotte's story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who needs hope today, and tell us in the comments. If you had been Charlotte, would you have spent your last $50 on that abandoned clock shop? Your answer might remind someone reading it tonight that their story isn't over yet.